So I'm going to jump right into it because I'm worried about making time. For disclosures, I have none, other than I will be referring to some specific trade names, and one in particular multiple times, among vaping devices, but I have absolutely no financial interest in any of those. So our agenda today, I want to talk about what are e-cigarettes, because that may sound basic, but I think it's helpful to really understand what all the components are and the different versions that are out there. And then talk about the prevalence of vaping among our youth and the health effects of vaping, what we know so far. And I want to spend some time talking about how we should talk to our patients about vaping in our clinical encounters. And then also focus on what's some advocacy that we can do outside of our clinic walls. What are regulations that we can push for to prevent future use? And then, there's been a lot of terrifying media coverage lately about vaping-related lung illnesses. Although the really focus of this talk is about the epidemic of nicotine vaping among youth. If time permits, I'll try to talk about that as well, because I imagine it's on many people's minds. So, what are e-cigarettes? Well, the picture on the left there sort of shows you the evolution since they first came out. When they first came out, they looked just sort of like cigarettes, and then pens came into more favor, and then box mods became the more popular device. Those are devices that are like tanks where you can refill it with different e-juices. And then more recently, what really is the most popular type of product now are vape pods, which have pre-filled cartridges that you just snap in and they're ready to go. What e-cigarettes do is they heat a liquid solution to a high enough temperature that it produces an aerosol that can be inhaled. And e-cigarettes are battery powered. Some come disposable, but most are rechargeable. And there are many compounds used in e-liquids, and most of those have been approved by the FDA for oral consumption, but the FDA has not reviewed the majority of those components for inhalation, and so there's really not much research regarding the safety of these compounds when they're inhaled. So let's briefly talk about what some of those compounds are. We know that pretty much all of them have vegetable glycerin and propylene glycol, flavoring chemicals, and then, of course, liquid nicotine. While these haven't really been reviewed yet, there are some things that we already know. We know that propylene glycol does form carcinogens when it's heated to a high temperature. So it's reasonable to think that maybe it's not the safest thing to inhale. Diacetyl is the most common product used for flavoring e-juices. And diacetyl was linked to popcorn lung back in the 80s, or bronchiolitis obliterans as we know it. Diacetyl used to be what was used to make microwavable popcorn and have the nice buttery flavor to it. And then it was realized that many of the people working in the factories that produced microwavable popcorn were getting bronchiolitis obliterans, and has since been banned for use in microwavable popcorn, but we're putting it in the e-juices that our youth are vaping now. And then other chemicals that are found, ultrafine particles, volatile organic chemicals, and then heavy metals like nickel and tin and lead, and formaldehyde are all things that are included in these e-juices. And then the liquid nicotine content varies significantly between different e-cig juices and e-cig products, but the newer pod-based ones tend to contain twice as much as the early e-cigs did. So pods, like I said, these are pre-filled cartridges that are meant to be, you just snap in and they're ready to go. There's really no fuss to them. So these are very appealing to consumers because they're low cost. You could buy a single Juul device for about $35, and 4 pods will cost about $15 right now. They're low maintenance, they're easy to use, and they're very sleek and discreet. Fits right in the palm of your hand. And the top selling brands are Juul and Fix and MyBlue. I have to tell you, when I first shared my slides with the CB committee, I had Juul over the talk, and they said, you really need to take out every mention of that specific company. And I about fell out of my seat. I don't think it'd be worth giving the talk if I couldn't mention Juul. And I want to share with you all why. So Juul entered the market in around 2017, late 2016, early 2017. And you can see just from July 2017 to December 2018, it went from being just an early entry into the market to being over 3/4 of the market share. And this isn't for pod systems, this is for all e-cig products. And the share is even higher than this chart shows. It's gone up even above that 76%. So it really is primarily what's being used. So much so that it's become part of the teen vernacular. Juuling is a verb. And you can ask someone, do they vape? And they will say no. You can ask that same person if they juul, and they will say yes. So it's like saying Google. Juuling is really the terminology. So what is it? Well, it resembles a USB flash drive. It can be charged in a laptop or the same USB charger that will charge your phone. You can actually purchase designer skins for it, so you can make it look even cooler. And there's little to no detectable odor or visible inhalant, or exhalant. So again, really sleek and discreet. And I'll get into this more in my talk later, but until a few months ago, it came in many, many fruit and candy flavors, which is really one of the main reasons that it became so appealing to youth. The nicotine content of Juul, they all do contain nicotine. So I've heard from multiple sources people thinking that they don't and that some come without, but every Juul pod contains nicotine, and they're all the same. It's the equivalent of about 20 cigarettes, or one pack of cigarettes is the same nicotine content as one Juul pod. And then Juul pods use nicotine salts, which delivers a higher volume of nicotine more smoothly, so without the throat irritation, than combustible cigarette would, or vaping products that contain free-base nicotine. The early products used to have free-base nicotine. You could still feel that sting in your throat. With nicotine salts, you don't feel that sting, and then also nicotine salts absorb much faster, so you get the hit a lot quicker. So who is vaping? Unquestionably, our youth. Every year the FDA puts out a National Youth Tobacco Survey, and the 2019 survey just came out in November, and it showed that 1 in 4 high school students and 1 in 10 middle school students indicated that they have vaped at least one time in the past month. Let's dive into that survey a little bit further. So that means over 5 million youth are currently using e-cigarettes, and that's a jump from last year, where it was 3.5 million. We've been seeing year-over-year increases, and last year's survey showed that e-cigarette use increased nearly 80% among high school students and 50% among middle school students. So we were thinking that we were probably hitting a peak, but we were wrong. It's jumped up quite a bit again. Even with all the negative media attention, it's still continuing to rise. And we look more closely at users. Nearly 1 million said that they use the product every day in the last month, and over 1.5 million youth said that they use the product at least 20 days in the past month. So, it's quite a few youth that are using it actually very, very frequently. And I want to show this graph on the bottom that shows you some trends. So, I think one myth that's been out there is that we can actually thank vaping products for the decline in combustible cigarette use. But what you can see here, so that dark blue line is high schoolers who use traditional combustible cigarettes, and the red line is high schoolers who use e-cigarettes. And before e-cigs arrived, smoking was already steadily declining. If I pull this graph all the way back to 2005, you would see that it started even higher and has just been on a steady decline from 2005 onwards. It sort of flattened out more recently. It actually flattened out after e-cigs came to the market, not before they came. Vaping entered the scene in about 2012, and by 2015, vaping had already spiked higher than even the smoking rate that was detected a decade earlier. And you can also see how the graph shows a decline, so that, again, that red line, a decline in vaping in 2016. So it seemed like the novelty was maybe wearing off with our youth a little bit, primarily when what was available was the open systems and only standard tobacco flavor. But then Juul hit the market in 2017, and you can see where the line goes from there. It's marked year-over-year increases ever since that hit the market. And if there's any additional evidence that this is an epidemic of our youth, the FDA also does a national health interview survey, the CDC does a national health interview survey of adults, and only 3% of adults indicate using e-cigarettes, with essentially a flat prevalence in e-cigarette use among adults from 2014 to 2019. So while there's been no increase among adults in that time frame, we've seen marked increases among youth. This is really an epidemic of the kids that we're seeing. Now, part of why we're seeing this increase is, as you can imagine, there's a lot of social use. About 60% of students who Juul report that they receive their vaping products socially rather than through purchasing it themselves. And educators report that youth are using Juul in classrooms, hallways, restrooms in school. They're sharing their devices with their peers. Again, it's small, easy to share, easy to hide, and there's really no detectable vapor in the air, and so it's very easy to use even in the classroom setting. And this social use encourages non-users to try Juul and enables students who are too young to purchase it themselves or who cannot otherwise afford them to still access it through their peers. So why is this such a concern that youth are vaping? Well, I talked before a little bit about the content in there, but there's no question that nicotine has harmful effects on our youth. And we know that youth are particularly susceptible to dependence and addiction because their brains are still developing. They're still developing well into their mid-20s. So during those ages, there's definitely much more chance of becoming addicted. If we just look at research on combustible cigarettes, 95% of people who smoke started before they were age 21. So we can think that that same kind of trend is going to be seen with these vaping products. Developing brains are also more susceptible to the rewarding effects of nicotine, and we know that nicotine has an impact on attention and memory, so it will affect learning. And nicotine use increases the risk for addiction to other drugs. The other real big concern is that our youth don't necessarily perceive it as risky. The 2016 Washington State Department of Health Youth Survey showed that only less than 30% of 10th graders thought of vaping as being harmful, even though 80% of them thought that traditional cigarettes were harmful. And there was research by the Truth Initiative. If you're not familiar with the Truth Initiative, that's a large nonprofit that does public health campaigns to try to attack the epidemic of tobacco use and also does good tobacco research as well. And they did a study in 2017 that showed that more than 60% of Juul users aged 15 to 24 did not know that the product contains nicotine. They actually thought it was just flavored vapor, that they were just enjoying the candy cane flavor or the unicorn milk was another flavor, and not realizing that they were actually taking in nicotine. And again, that one product is equivalent to 20 combustible cigarettes. The other thing is interesting that came out in that survey is that youth may not realize that nicotine is highly addictive. So youth have this sense that the harmful part of combustible cigarettes is the tobacco, and it's the tobacco that's bad and not necessarily the nicotine that's bad. And so now you've taken the tobacco away and have this pure nicotine that is not as harmful. That was another thing that's come out in surveys. Going back to that myth that e-cigarettes are actually helping people quit cigarettes, we actually see that the opposite is true in our youth. The 2018 National Academies had a report on the public health consequences of e-cigarette use and showed that there's substantial evidence that e-cigarette use actually increases the risk of using combustible cigarettes among our youth. And a couple other studies that I'll share with you. There were two that were in JAMA, one with ninth graders in LA that showed that e-cigarette users were about 3 times as likely to initiate cigarette smoking a year after starting use of e-cigs. And there was another one on young adults in Connecticut that showed that they were 8 times as likely to initiate smoking cigarettes a year after starting e-cigs. And then there was also a study in the Journal of Pediatrics that shows some moderate evidence that e-cigarette use increases the frequency and intensity of smoking if you do both together. Now, also the National Youth Tobacco Survey, I wanted to show you a couple other interesting things that came up. So for the 6th year in a row, e-cigs were the most commonly used tobacco product among our youth, and that's not surprising. But we're also seeing a rise in some other products again, and particularly cigars. This was the first year ever of the survey that cigars were actually reported as used more than cigarettes. And 1 in 3 respondents in the survey, and this is both high school and middle school students, reported using, if they used 2 tobacco products, it was more common to use e-cigs and cigars than e-cigs and cigarettes. Now, we have a pretty good theory for why this is. So in 2009, our federal government actually did ban flavorings for traditional cigarettes. So some of the cigarette makers were starting to make flavored products, and the federal government did put a ban in place for any flavor other than menthol. That ban did not extend to any other tobacco products, and there are now a lot of flavors coming onto the market for cigars, and especially cigarellos. Cigarellos are like mini cigars that are about the size of a cigarette, but they're actually cigars. And those come in about as many flavors now as the e-juices come. And that's probably why we're seeing this jump of cigars now. So why does e-cig use progress to combustible cigarette use? Well, e-cigarettes mimic combustible cigarette use, and so they just help renormalize smoking behavior. And then the pleasurable sensation that's caused by nicotine results in seeking more sources. And if vapor products are favorable, then you might expect that other tobacco products would be enjoyable as well. And then, of course, as we know in teens, risk behaviors build. So it sort of opens the door to other risk behaviors. And then e-cigarette retailers, so you go in a store to buy cigarettes, they typically advertise and sell traditional cigarettes too. So then the user being exposed to the marketing of those other products. So I'll touch a little on the health effects of vape aerosols, which admittedly we know very little. Some obvious sort of short-term effects. We know there can be some mouth and throat irritation, or there can be nausea, or headache, or coughs, increased blood pressure, increased heart rate. These are things that we know nicotine can cause. Now, having said that, the mouth and throat irritation, as I alluded to before, has become sort of minimal with the use of nicotine salts. That really isn't an issue anymore. But some of those other symptoms can exist in an early user who has not used and become acclimated to it yet. Secondhand exposure, what are the risks? The data is very, very limited. There are low levels of nicotine in secondhand aerosol, so that can be detected. And there's been some animal data to show that exposure to secondhand cigarette vapor can affect lung function. And when we get to the long-term effects, it's really unknown. The issue here is that we don't have long-term studies. This has become an epidemic in the last about year and a half or 2 years. And the same way it took years and years to get good research on traditional cigarettes, it's going to take that long to get really good research on these products. But we can't wait because we know the epidemic is happening now. And I think it's very biologically plausible that the long-term exposure to e-cigarettes could increase the risk of serious disease. And I think it's safe to say that e-cigarettes do have less toxicants than combustible cigarettes. So we can say that, but safer doesn't necessarily mean safe. If our bar to be safe is to be better than cigarettes, that's a pretty low bar. And again, just going back to what I said earlier in the talk, when we look at the other compounds that are in there besides nicotine, these are probably harmful too. Again, there's formaldehyde and free radicals, and that heated, we know does produce carcinogens. So could this be causing cancer down the line? Again, diacetyl is what's used for most flavorings, and so are we going to see more bronchiolitis obliterans? And then ultrafine particles, can those deposit into the lung and cause chronic lung disease? These are all very theoretical possibilities that we worry we're going to start to see in the future. And there's other health risks besides inhaling too. So explosions and burns is a risk. Between 2015 and 2017, there were over 2,000 e-cigarette explosion and burn injuries that presented to U.S. emergency departments. You might remember in the news a few years ago, the lithium-ion batteries and Samsung phones are exploding. Most e-cig products use that same type of battery. So we see these explosions in e-cigs too. And then the larger concern, particularly among our younger patients that we see, are the risk of poisoning through ingestion or skin absorption. Nicotine poisoning can happen when vapor liquid is ingested or absorbed through the eyes or the skin, and particularly in younger children who have more porous skin, it's more easier for them to absorb it. In 2017, there were about 450 calls to the Washington Poison Center for nicotine exposure, and about 85% of those were for kids under 5. And some of the symptoms that have been reported when calls are made to the Poison Center are vomiting, nausea, sweating, dizziness. At higher exposures, there's been lethargy or seizures or respiratory muscle weakness. And it's estimated that about 1 teaspoon of liquid nicotine, if fully ingested, could kill an average-sized toddler. So this is a concern too. Thankfully, there has been some movement on protecting young children from exposure. So there was a Child Nicotine Poisoning Prevention Act that was passed by the federal government in 2016 that requires the liquid nicotine be sold in childproof packaging. So at least it comes in that packaging, but that still doesn't change the fact that we need to advise teens who use that might have younger siblings, or any parents that we learn who are using who have young children, to keep e-cigarettes and liquid nicotine locked up and out of reach of their young children. And then to follow specific disposal instructions on the label for the e-juices, since there's typically some remaining in the cartridges that are thrown away. And then if the exposure to nicotine occurs, they need to call the poison center, and people need to know that this can be poisonous. Now, what about e-cigarettes for smoking cessation? That's really, when they first came to market, that was sort of how they were marketed, and I think a lot of people still see them for that purpose. The evidence on that is pretty weak too. There isn't good research that shows that it's a great way to quit smoking, and there are plenty of FDA-approved AIDS, nicotine replacement therapy, that we know is effective. So that's really what we should be recommending, as opposed, we shouldn't be recommending using e-cigs to quit smoking, we should be recommending nicotine replacement therapy. And as I said before, completely substituting e-cigarettes for combustible tobacco probably would reduce exposure to toxins and carcinogens. So yes, if you switch from smoking traditional cigarettes to e-cigs, it probably is safer, but again, that does not mean it's safe. And what we know is that when youth especially use e-cigs, they do progress to using combustible tobacco, and that dual use is becoming increasingly common among our youth. And most adults who use are dual users. So that 3% of adults that use e-cigs, the majority of them actually still use combustible tobacco too. So how should we talk to our patients? When we are at well exams or anytime we see our teens, how should we bring it up with them? Well, I think one key takeaway I'd like you to have is that you got to start before middle school. 1 in 10 middle schoolers are vaping right now, so we can't wait until they're already doing it to start talking. We need to talk before then. And we need to be really specific in our questions. One of the things that got me interested in this topic is when I was reading about how vaping was taking off a couple years ago, I was asking all my patients, do you vape? And they were almost always saying no. And then I spoke to a colleague of mine who said, well, do you ask them if they juul? Started asking them that question, which I wasn't doing. And once I started asking that question, I realized that the responses changed quickly. And it really is true still that if you ask, do you juul, you're going to elicit a different response. Now, before I mentioned too that there's the tank systems, the box mods, that also is a verb too. So someone might mod and not juul. And again, they may say no to vaping. So it's also a good question to ask, do you mod? So knowing this terminology for us pediatric providers is important when we're really trying to assess risk. And then it's important that we educate youth about the amount of nicotine in juul. Again, there was a study that shows 60% didn't know there's nicotine in there. I think as there is more awareness and more media attention, I think youth are starting to understand there's nicotine, but I don't know that they still understand just how much or that it's actually bad. Again, there's this myth that tobacco bad, nicotine by itself okay. We need to dispel that myth. And then it's also important that we educate parents about the rise of juul use in schools. I bet most parents don't know the results of that survey that I just shared with you. 1 in 10 middle schoolers, 1 in 4 high schoolers. Parents need to know that. This is something that they should be talking about in their home and be looking for in their home. And then we can help teens quit vaping. Since we are seeing plenty of teens who are already using, we need to know how to help them quit. So traditional nicotine replacement therapy that's been used for smoking can be used to quit vaping, but it's not necessarily the most desirable way for teens to quit vaping. They tend to like more modern technology as ways to do anything. And so thankfully, the Truth Initiative has launched an innovative resource that's aimed at teens. They have a new social media campaign called Ready to Ditch Juul. And it's videos on YouTube that highlight young people ditching their juuls in creative ways. And they're pretty entertaining. I think you'd like to watch them, and it hopefully will lead some to quit. But those videos also link you to Truth This Is Quitting app. The This Is Quitting app is a free and anonymous text-based app that you can use to quit vaping. It was introduced in January 2019, so it's just a year old right now. And there's up to about 80,000 enrollees so far in this app. And there's preliminary data in a journal, Nicotine and Tobacco Research Journal, that showed that 61% of early enrollees reported that they had either significantly reduced or stopped using e-cigarettes altogether just 2 weeks after enrolling in the app. So it's promising early evidence that this app can be effective. The way our patients can sign up for it, and again, it's free, is just texting ditch juul to 88709. They can do that to enroll for free. What we are still combating, though, as we're trying to help teens quit or not start, is e-cigarette advertising. Another reason why I think we've seen this rapid rise is because E-cigarette companies can actually legally promote their products in ways that traditional cigarettes can't anymore. So in 1998, through the Master Settlement Agreement with the federal government, large cigarette companies were no longer allowed to do television, radio ads, or billboards, or outdoor signage, or do sponsorships. That was banned, but that doesn't apply to e-cigarette companies, which is why they've been able to very freely advertise. And in the National Youth Tobacco Survey that alluded to before, 9 out of 10 respondents said that they have been exposed to ads that they find appealing. So what about the role of the FDA? Why are they not investigating the effects of these components? Why are they not regulating this advertising? Well, in 2016, the FDA initially had expanded its authority to regulate tobacco products to include e-cigarettes and cigars, but then a year later it announced that the manufacturers would have until 2022 to submit data to them, and until then they could just stay on the market unregulated. So they sort of kicked the can several years down the line. In the meantime, no regulation. Now, in March of 2018, the American Pediatrics joined with several other organizations to sue the Department of Health and Human Services, saying that that decision to allow manufacturers to keep selling e-cigarettes without proper review was putting our children at risk. And in May of 2019, a federal judge just ruled in our favor, so that's promising. You can imagine it's getting appealed right now, so it may still go to the Supreme Court, but at least right now the federal courts have ruled in our favor, saying the FDA can't wait till 2022, that they should be starting right now. And the FDA has taken some recent actions in light of that decision. Some things the FDA has done, they did require that all flavored e-cigarettes, excluding menthol and mint, that contain nicotine can only be sold in age-restricted stores or sold online with age verification. Doesn't have a lot of teeth to it. We all know it's pretty easy to figure out what birthday would allow you to get into a website. But nonetheless, those sites now have to have that first page where you put your birthday in. And then the FDA did partner with the Federal Trade Commission to target e-liquid manufacturers who they believe are using images appealing to youth in their advertising. So not fully regulating advertising, but at least contacting those who are using these images and asking them to self-regulate. And then they did work to remove online listings on third-party sites like eBay, so that they have to be sold in sites that, again, can do that age verification. And then ordered manufacturers to take other voluntary actions to prevent youth access and youth appeal. As we know, voluntary actions, again, don't have a lot of teeth. But Juul has been doing some things recently, I think likely because they've been under a lot of fire. Some examples of the way Juul has been under fire lately. Seattle Public Schools in King County joined multiple other school districts and local governments across the country in suing Juul, claiming that they have been marketing directly to youth. And the suits are seeking damages and funding for prevention education and addiction treatment. And in response to all this backlash, Juul did decide to stop selling most flavors in retail stores as of November 2018. They were still selling them online, but not in retail stores. But then they stopped selling flavors other than menthol and mint in both stores and online in November 2019. So this is right after the Youth Tobacco Survey came out. And then a few weeks later, due to additional negative attention and fire, they stopped selling mint as well. So now they're just selling menthol as the only flavor. And that's a big change from how many flavors were available just several months ago. They've also stopped their social media promotions. So the ads that they were doing on Facebook, for example, they've halted doing those. And have also announced a suspension on all print and media ads. So this is all promising. It's, that Juul is taking these steps. Now, before we get too excited, that's out of the goodness of their heart, as opposed to trying to show that they're doing the right thing. They did just hire a new CEO in September who came from Altria, which was formerly Philip Morris, or the makers of Marlboro. Their CEO is now the CEO of Juul, and Altria now owns a 35% stake in Juul as well. So this is a company with a lot of marketing savvy and a lot of history in figuring out how to continue to make profit while also showing that you're doing the right thing. So what kind of advocacy can we engage in beyond our patient encounters? There's a lot we can do. So one thing is Tobacco 21 legislation is something that we can celebrate. I think it was about a year ago this week that I testified to our state Senate on the Tobacco 21 bill, which ended up passing our state legislature last year. the Washington chapter of the American County Pediatrics played a instrumental role in getting that passed. But I would say what was really effective when we were pushing for that legislation last year, now you my testimony, and then after that, a couple of teens came up, and one of them talked about her own addiction, one talked about her brother's addiction, and those two just like, I think there was silence in the room, and I think they were so effective in delivering that message about what a big deal this is. And thankfully, our legislature, after 4 years in a row of not passing it, passed the legislation last year. And then even better, federal legislation was just signed last month, requiring that you have to be 21 years old to purchase these products. So that's a big recent win. And I'm going to get into a little bit more about why I think that's such a big win. We could also advocate for prohibiting the sale of flavored tobacco products. And these flavors are what makes them so appealing, so if we can get the flavors off the market, that would make a big difference. We could also push to ban vaping in public spaces, the same way we ban combustible cigarettes in public places. We can tax vapor products, which has been the sin taxes have been very effective for other things like cigarettes. We can regulate the advertising and marketing, and we can also regulate the density and zoning of stores. So there's not streets you're driving down with multiple vape shops in a row. So why is tobacco 21 such a victory? Why are we excited about this? Well, as I said before, youth are more susceptible to addiction. We know from cigarette studies that virtually all, 95% of adult smokers had their first cigarette before turning 21, and about 80% had their first cigarette before turning 18. So by pushing the sale to 21, we're hopefully getting fewer people to start during the ages where they're most likely to become addicted. We also know that 18 and 19-year-olds are usually suppliers for younger teens who rely on friends and peers to buy tobacco products. So this law now raises the age to purchase after high school graduation. So hopefully we'll bring some of the suppliers out of our high schools. And increasing the sales of age for tobacco products to 21 also just helps counter the industry's efforts to market to teens. And hopefully matching the age for alcohol sales and tobacco sales will make compliance and enforcement easier, because that's the other tricky part about laws like this, is still enforcing them. And that is a real problem. There was a JAMA Pediatrics article this year that showed that only 47% of vape shops in California were actually carding people when purchasing products. So even before tobacco 21 passed, you still have to be 18 to purchase, but the shops, only half the shops were carding, at least in one state. And then the Truth Initiative survey that I talked about before showed that about 75% of 9 to 17-year-olds were successful in purchasing from an actual retail store. So again, you have to be 18, and yet respondents as young as 9 said that they were able to purchase without getting carded at all. So enforcement's going to be important. And then banning the sale of flavored products. Here in Washington State, Governor Inslee issued an executive order to ban the sale of all flavored vape products, and our State Board of Health implemented that in October. Unfortunately, that ban expires on February 7th, so there's only several days left for that ban. So it's up to our state legislature to make it permanent. The governor did what they could, but executive orders in our state have only a certain number of months that they can be in place before the legislature has to ultimately endorse them to make them permanent law. So that's before legislature now. And then in September, President Trump announced a plan to issue an executive order to ban all flavored products from retail outlets throughout the U.S. But then he later backtracked after quite a bit of pressure from the industry. And just on January 2nd, the administration announced their final rule, which is a lot weaker than what was initially talked about in September. The final rule allows Juul and other closed pods, pre-filled pods, to continue selling menthol flavor, and it still keeps all flavored e-juices sold for open systems, so like the mods that you fill yourself. Those flavors are still on the market. So why is this watered down federal ban unlikely to really curb the vape epidemic? Well, many teens are likely just going to switch from their current preferred flavors to menthol. Mint was already Juul's best-selling flavor anyway. And in fact, most manufacturers who had a separate menthol and mint product are now starting to relabel their mint flavors menthol, because they are slightly different, and they found that the mint tends to be more preferred, so they're just calling that menthol now, and it's mint. And so that's one reason why I think leaving menthol on the market is a problem, and that one should have been banned too. There are already plenty of YouTube videos up showing you how to refill your Juul pod. So showing you how to buy e-juice that's made for mods and use it to refill what the pod that you would otherwise dispose of for your Juul, and keep using it with all the flavors that are out there. And then teens can also just switch to open systems. They've gotten much more user-friendly. So Before they were a little more clunky and not as user-friendly as Juuls, but they're getting easier and easier to use. I promised I was going to mention some other devices. So some refillable devices that are gaining popularity: Aspire, Smock, Sorin, Lost Vape, Orion. These are a few products that have come out in the last couple of years that are pretty user-friendly products where you can actually refill them with the e-juices of the many, many flavors that are out there. So a couple of years from now, we maybe have to ask our teens, do you Aspire? Do you Smock? This might have become our vernacular too. And there are actually way more flavor options for the open systems than Juul ever sold. Like we're talking, Juul had like, a couple dozen flavors. There's hundreds of flavors of the e-juices out there. There's actually like several different ones that just start with the name unicorn. And so this is a problem. I think we're just going to see maybe a switch to which products are used. So what are some bills before our current state legislature that the Washington chapter AAP is advocating for, and I really encourage you all to advocate for? A permanent ban on flavored nicotine products, including menthol in our state, and then limiting the amount of nicotine in pre-filled vape products to the same as a single cigarette. This is something that has taken off in Europe. Some European countries have done this, where they've limited the percentage of nicotine that can be in a pod, so it's only the equivalent of 1 cigarette as opposed to 20 cigarettes. So that's legislation that we have here in our state right now. And then increasing the taxes on vaping products according to nicotine content. So right now, if you look at the tax on a pack of cigarettes in our state, it's about $3. And if you look at the tax on a Juul pod in our state, it's 19 cents. So that's like a 95% less for the same nicotine content. And we know from previous experience that raising taxes on tobacco products was actually a very effective public health measure to reduce cigarette use among youth. Like that's because youth have less money, and they also have a shorter usage history, so if they haven't been smoking too long, hopefully they're not addicted yet. And so increasing the tax rate to be more equivalent to cigarettes could be effective. And we also have to make sure that that tax revenue is allocated to enforcement of vaping laws and prevention of vaping initiation, because again, that's hard to do, and that would be meaningful. So I think I do have time to talk about vape-related lung illness, so I'm going to switch gears because I'm getting close to time. So the CDC calls it EVALI, or e-cigarette or vaping-associated lung illness. But in the media, pretty much it's called vapor-related lung illness. And it's been pretty darn scary. The outbreak began in June of 2019. And thankfully, the cases have been declining since the peak in September. So far, there have been about 2,600 hospitalizations across all 50 states. And there's been 57 deaths that have come from 27 of our states. The median age of those hospitalized has been 24 years old. But the median age of those deceased has been 51 years old, so it does seem those who pass away from it oftentimes do have some other lung issue to begin with as well. And the youngest person who's passed away so far has been 15 years old. So far, we don't know for sure what's causing this, but the lab data shows that vitamin E acetate is very closely associated. It was identified in the bronchial lavage fluid samples from 48 to 51 cases that the CDC tested, and that was from patients across 16 states. So we think there's regional differences in what's being sold, but across multiple states, they found vitamin E acetate in those samples, and there were none found in the comparison group. So looking at products that were vaped by people who did not get EVALI, they couldn't find this product or this additive. But there are other contents in these pods too, and so there may be more than one cause. Vitamin E acetate is actually used in moisturizing creams. It's used as a nutritional supplement. It's used in processed foods. So this is a really good example of something that is FDA approved for ingestion. It's considered safe for a topical use ingestion for years and years. But right now it's looking to us like vitamin E acetate, if you heat it and inhale it, it can cause severe lung illness. So that goes back to what I was saying before about all the products that are in the vaping products out there that we can't say for sure that they're harmful. There's a pretty reasonable thing to think that they probably are, and this is one where we're seeing right now some evidence that it looks like it's very harmful. Now, what vitamin E acetate is, or why it's showing up, it's used in black market vape marijuana e-juices to cut THC oil and increase profits, because the viscosity of vitamin E acetate is about identical to the viscosity of THC oil. And so they're basically using it to cut THC oil and sort of make a cheaper product and sell it for the same price and make more money. And 80% of surveyed patients reporting vaping THC or sorry, 80% of patients who've had a volley have reported vaping THC, with only 13% saying that they only vape nicotine. The belief, though, is those who thought they were only vaping nicotine probably were vaping THC, because the FDA has not found vitamin E acetate in any nicotine products analyzed to date. They've only found it in THC products, and they pretty much found it in many of the black market THC e-juices that we're manufacturing. So here in Washington State, for example, the legally sold THC products in retail stores have not been implicated yet in this crisis. It's been black market ones. And since knowing brands is important when you're talking to patients, the brands that have so far seemed to be responsible, on the East Coast, there's Dank. In the Midwest, it's TKO, and on the West Coast, it's Smart Cart. But any of those products can make it anywhere. But if you were to find out that a patient of yours has been vaping Smart Cart, chances are it's a black market marijuana product that probably has vitamin E acetate in it, and would be particularly dangerous. So that's really what we know about the volley right now, and we're still getting to learn more. And we are at least thankful that at least seems like so far the peak has passed, but we're certainly not out of the woods. There's still been cases in the last in this month. And I think we're exactly at time. So I'm going to stop there, and we'll have more time for questions later. Thank you.